Hi, this is Chris Moyer, and I'm continuing my reading of the paper entitled, Why I'm Considering Giving Up Trying to Communicate with God. This is part 2. Suppose you're a Mormon, and you believe in the Book of Mormon because you get a warm feeling in your tummy when you read it. Is there any way to validate that feeling as being proof that God is speaking to you? Can't you get that warm feeling in your tummy when you snuggle up next to your new puppy or kitten? Or when you hug your children? If this is the case, doesn't it follow that God speaking to you through the Book of Mormon is no different quantifiably than God speaking to you through the little puppy at your side? How can we definitively know that some idea we have that we think God has placed on our heart is not just something that we have placed on our heart ourselves? Do we really know where we end and God begins? Many people who fancy themselves scholars take the rational approach to religion and use the most subtle theological distinctions to prove to others that their understanding is the most rational. Since when did God ever require an IQ test to get into heaven? I used to regard with cynicism the popular adage that all religions are basically the same, and their purpose is to achieve closeness with God and love for their neighbor. I thought this was a saying made popular by ignorant people. I was cynical about it because I had the viewpoint that Christianity was such a superior religion, and Christ was so far above all other religious founders, and every other viewpoint was basically irrational and godless. Perhaps religions are not basically the same in all their specific characteristics, but the people within them are. Perhaps some have leaders who are pathological liars and murderers, or polygamists. Perhaps some have intolerant leaders who have no room for independent thinking. But that doesn't mean all their followers are aware of their leaders' deficiencies and want to follow in their footsteps. Just as there are many Christians and Jews today who would believe King David was a great leader and a man who stood at God's side, who don't necessarily feel inclined to follow in his polygamist activities, there are also many Mormons who believe Joseph Smith was a great prophet of God, yet they do not feel inclined to become polygamists themselves, even though Joseph Smith advocated polygamy for all men. It is sometimes interesting to me how some Christians pick their fights. They point out the deficiencies in the leaders and prophets of other faiths, somehow implying that the entire faith is false. Yet they uphold the writings of some who are just about as deficient as any spiritual leader can be, and declare those writings to be Holy Scripture, breathed by God. If you are going to use character of authorship as a basis for determining whether a text is divinely inspired, then you must be consistent across the board. You rail against Joseph Smith because he was a polygamist, yet you hail King David as one after God's own heart, who was not just a polygamist, but also an adulterer and a murderer. Why do you do this? Because King David could write eloquently about his love for God? We have a word for people who act the part of the saint, but whose actions are atrocious. We call them hypocrites, not people after God's own heart. But because our Bible tells us that David was a man after God's own heart, we believe it without question. Consider the source. Whoever wrote the verse obviously hailed David as king, and what nationalistic entity doesn't hold up their king in the greatest light? When King David went on his murderous expeditions, wiping out thousands of enemies, even cutting off their foreskins in exchange for a bride, we hail him as a great warrior of God. But what we cannot understand, however, is that the mentality of Osama bin Laden is not so different. To Osama, we here in America are evil, materialist pigs. We let our women run around practically naked. We produce media that contains loads of explicit and demeaning language. We poke fun at God. I'm sure that to Osama, who fancies himself close to God as well, it seems Satan is controlling our culture. Well, perhaps to David, it seemed that Satan was controlling the Philistine culture, or any other culture he happened to come across that did not seem friendly to Israel, which was pretty much everybody at that time. David felt he was acting in the best interests of God by slaying all those Philistines, and Osama felt he was acting in the best interests of Allah by orchestrating the attack against America on 9/11. In saying this, I'm not trying to justify Osama's behavior in any way and suggest that, like David, he had a divine right to do so. I'm actually asking you to take a look at the behaviors of both of these two men who waged jihad and ask yourselves, what are the quantifiable differences between the two? Why were David's murderous expeditions justified, but Osama's were not? The Bible tells us that's what happened. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh yes, of course. It's because God instructed David to do so. We have proof. The Bible tells us that's what happened. But the Quran, now that was inspired by the devil, so we can rightfully say that Satan was the one who inspired Osama to carry out his mission. Please don't miss the sarcasm in my voice. Now please don't jump to the conclusion that because of what I said I am against all religions. It's actually quite the opposite. I think we should think twice before attempting to attack and demean other religions. I think we should ease up on our obsession with our concept of God being the only proper way to perceive God, and allow others the freedom to experience God the way they want without feeling a constant need to conform their thinking to ours. I guess the primary theological tenet I'm rubbing up against here is the idea that a proper and correct understanding of God must be attained in order to avoid hell. I do not really feel the threatening parts of any religion are especially beneficial, but rather are most harmful, psychologically, emotionally, and yes, even spiritually. The idea of hell has been used too often as a sort of divine blackmail. Many conservatives and fundamentalists think hell should be preached more in the culture, but I cannot see any positive results that this might attain other than intimidating those within hellfire-preaching faiths from thinking outside the box of their religion and trying to gain and adopt wider perspectives on reality. I have a strong suspicion if a man ever did arise on the scene who was able to intoxicate the emotions of a crowd by terrifying them with the most creative and torturous images of hell, like Jonathan Edwards did many years ago, the suicide rates for those exposed to his words would go up dramatically, especially for those who are emotionally unstable. Now, as far as there being good religions and bad religions, I don't think there is such a distinction between the two in God's eyes. I rather think God makes a much greater distinction between good people and bad people. I don't think there is a person on earth who would deny there are good people in bad religions and bad people in good religions. So shouldn't we celebrate the goodness in people and encourage them in the things that matter to them, rather than trying to tear down the religions? If we see a good person believing the wrong things from our perspective, why do we feel incumbent upon ourselves to correct their error and show them the correct way to think? Did they ask us for guidance? If they did, it seems certainly okay for us to do this, but if they are happy and content with their beliefs, why is it so hard for us to just accept them as being okay the way they are? Why do we feel the burden of rewiring their thinking? Perhaps we are deluded by a popular misconception that arises within groups of similar thinking people who box themselves in with a dogma common to all in the group. Mainly, we are the only ones who are truly happy and fulfilled, and everyone else only thinks they are happy and fulfilled, but in reality they are not. This is a popular notion that people often use to justify sticking to their particular faith, even if they feel their life sucks and their faith doesn't seem to be helping things. They may never actually admit this to other members of the faith, risking alienation. Instead, they will choose to believe that as bad as they feel, people who live their lives outside of the faith must feel even worse, not having the truth as they do, so they should stick it out with their faith. Sure, people outside your particular faith may look happy on the outside, but it can't be genuine happiness, because that can only come from a relationship from Jesus Christ, or Allah, or Jehovah, or whoever. It is only temporary happiness based on some fleeting pleasure that will be here today and gone tomorrow. In spite of what the person of faith is going through, they will always convince themselves that there is some greater purpose for their suffering, that it is making them stronger as a person, that God is putting them through this to increase their faith and ultimately prepare them for heaven. So in placing their individual life frustrations amongst the greater story of eternal salvation and redemption, it is no wonder that many within faiths report deep joy even in the midst of terrible suffering. And yet many of them conclude that others outside of their faith cannot experience similar joy amidst hardship, although this certainly does not follow. To be continued.